Last week marked 100 years of domestic tank construction. On August 31, 1920, the first trials of the Renault Russian, the first domestically designed tank to enter serial production, took place. Less than a decade and a half later, the Red Army possessed the largest armored vehicle fleet in the world. And in December 1939, the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army officially adopted the T-34, the most produced tank of the Second World War and the main Soviet tank from 1942 to the first half of the 1950s. Every year, on the second Sunday of September, tank crews celebrate their professional holiday. This article was prepared for that date and is dedicated to the T-34 family. Many opinions exist about this combat vehicle, often contradictory. The purpose of this piece is to give an objective assessment of the T-34, a tank that fully deserves its title as the best tank in history. Before discussing the T-34 itself, it is worth recalling what the Red Army's tank system looked like in the pre-war period. It consisted of tanks of several types. Some time ago, a theory became popular in narrow circles claiming that instead of developing the T-34, the Soviet Union should have continued to develop the T-28. However, from the tank system outlined above, it is immediately clear that such an idea is laughable. The T-28 belonged to an entirely different class. In 1938, both the T-28 and the T-35 were classified as breakthrough tanks. Under this category, in 1938, work began on the SMK-1 and T-100 tanks, and later appeared the KV, which replaced the T-28. Moreover, the T-28 itself was already outdated and should have been retired earlier. Its intended successor, the T-29, failed during trials. As for the A-20 and A-32, the ancestors of the T-34, they were designed as replacements for the BT series. At the same time, reconnaissance tanks continued to exist, represented by the T-40, while the general-purpose tank evolved into a support tank. After several attempts, the T-50 support tank was finally created to replace the T-26. It should be noted that the only real competitors to the predecessors of the T-34 were the amphibious wheeled-tracked PT-1A and the wheeled-tracked BT-SV. Both vehicles disappeared from correspondence before the summer of 1938, and there were not even attempts to create alternatives to the future BT replacement, simply because there was no one left to do so. After the wave of repressions that swept through Soviet tank production in 1937 to 1938, genuine competition existed only in the field of heavy tanks. Supporters of the idea that the T-28 should have been further developed fail to understand that by the second half of the 1930s, the T-28's design had reached its limits and had nowhere to evolve. The A-20 and A-32 in their initial forms were not equivalent to the T-28. These tanks had a combat weight between 39,600 and 41,800 pounds, and tests showed that in tracked mode, the A-32 even slightly outperformed the A-20. Based on the test results, the idea arose to enhance the armor protection of the T-32, which ultimately led to the creation of the T-34. At the moment of its official adoption, the T-34 as we know it did not yet exist. What was accepted into service was the T-32, which required improvements in armor protection, better visibility, and installation of the 76mm F-32 gun. That modified tank received the designation T-34. Its combat weight increased to 56,400 pounds, prompting significant redesigns, including the running gear. It should be noted that at the time, such an increase in weight was entirely normal. The closest German counterpart, the PES KPFW III, initially had a combat weight of 33,000 pounds, but in mass production it grew to 43,000 pounds and a year later exceeded 44,000 pounds. A sharp increase in tank weight also occurred in both British and American tank design. By June 1940, Soviet tank building had undergone major changes. The new armament system included the heavy KV tank, the medium T-34, the amphibious T-40, and the infantry support T-26. The latter was to be gradually phased out once a new support tank appeared. As for the T-28 and T-35, their status remained uncertain. In military correspondence, the T-28 was no longer called a medium tank, and there were no plans for its further development either in the main tank directorate or at the Kirov plant. The fact that the T-28 and T-34 turned out to be similar in weight and armament was more a coincidence than a deliberate design choice. Along with the change in the tank system came a shift in overall concept. Before the war, the Red Army had no medium tanks in the modern sense. The T-28 was a quality reinforcement tank, a vehicle close to breakthrough tanks. Instead, there were two types of light tanks, the general-purpose T-26 and the operational BT. The latter acted as a kind of substitute for a medium tank. At that time, 12-ton medium tanks were considered the standard, but in practice, their combat capabilities differed little from light tanks. Abroad, the situation evolved similarly. Light tanks formed the backbone of armored forces, while medium tanks played secondary roles. The reasons varied. Sometimes medium tanks failed to meet expectations, as with the American convertible medium tank T-4, which barely outperformed the light M2. And sometimes they simply turned out unsuccessful, as with the British, who began mass-producing medium tanks only in January 1939 after many failed attempts. There were also more complex cases. For example, the French, instead of building quite decent medium Char D2 tanks, decided to focus on heavy Char B1 bis tanks. Thus, by the start of the Second World War, all tank-producing nations, without exception, possessed huge flocks of light tanks. At the same time, even before the war, some countries began to realize that the main vehicle should be the medium tank. Such ideas appeared among the British and the Germans, though industry lagged behind military theory, and the tanks produced often did not fully meet expectations. Nevertheless, by 1940, both Britain and Germany had almost completely switched to medium tanks, in both cases as a planned and deliberate step. In the Soviet Union, this process was somewhat delayed, since serial production of the T-34 began only in the summer of 1940. However, by the end-of-year plans of 1940, it was already clear that the T-34 was becoming the main tank. It was expected that by January 1, 1942, there would be 2,850 of them, with a total goal of 4,200 tanks of this type. Meanwhile, only 800 T-50 infantry support tanks were planned for production in 1941. Later, in June 1941, new figures appeared, which some researchers misinterpreted. According to those plans, 4,000 T-50 tanks were to be produced in 1942, plus another 10,000 in 1943. From this, the myth arose that the T-50 had been intended as the main tank. In reality, that was wishful thinking. The same plans called for 8,000 T-34s in 1942 and 15,000 in 1943, while even heavy KVs were to be produced in numbers not much lower than the T-50, 4,500 in 1942 and 7,500 in 1943. Thus, the era of light tank dominance had ended even before the war began. Another matter was that, as of January 1, 1941, the Red Army still had 9,987 T-26 tanks and 7,752 of the BT family, and it had to fight with what it already had. Naturally, the beginning of the Second World War greatly affected the plans for producing T-34 tanks. However, the production volumes of these tanks turned out to be roughly the same, and even slightly higher than in the pre-war plans. A similar situation occurred with the KV tanks. Several factors contributed to this. First, unlike the T-50 tank, serial production of the T-34 began as early as the summer of 1940, which made it possible to more or less establish the manufacturing process, including hull production. Second, by the summer of 1941, the tank was already being produced at two plants, one in Kharkov and the Stalingrad tractor plant. And by September 1941, a third plant in Gorky had joined. Third, after almost a year of production, the earliest problems had been partially solved. Of course, the tank had its shortcomings. We will talk about them later. But it is worth noting that some of these were planned to be resolved during a major modernization that was supposed to receive the designation T-34M. Unfortunately, that did not happen, although some elements of the modernized T-34 were later incorporated into the production model. These included chevron pattern tracks, a driver's hatch with two observation devices, as well as the general design of the hexagonal turret and its characteristic gun mounting. The evacuation of the Kharkov plant to Nizhny Tagil affected production volumes. In addition, the engine plant also had to be evacuated. Incidentally, engines were for some time a bottleneck. Even before the war, it had been planned to begin production of the V2 engine at the Stalingrad tractor plant, where it was assigned the index STZ-12, but that plan never materialized. In late 1941 and early 1942, some T-34 and KV-1 tanks were fitted with M17T engines. However, this lasted only briefly. The engine plant was evacuated to Chelyabinsk, and in December 1941, an engine plant was established in Sverdlovsk. Around the same time, another was organized in Barnaul. Thus, by early 1942, the foundations were laid for a further increase in T-34 production. The enormous losses suffered by the Red Army's tank formations in 1941 forced a revision of the tank production program. As a result, a tank appeared in the plan that otherwise would not have existed. The T-60, a light tank created on the basis of the T-40 amphibious reconnaissance tank. Yes, it was a major step backward, but the T-60 could be built at plants without heavy crane equipment, used automobile components, and most importantly, could be mass-produced. Therefore, it is not surprising that the 1942 plan called for 27,500 tanks of this type. As for the T-34, 15,000 were to be produced. However, it is important to understand that there was a significant gap between plans and reality. On March 6, 1942, the Red Army adopted the light T-70 tank, which replaced the T-50 that had effectively died back in early January. It was also intended to replace the T-60, but in practice, of the 4 plants producing the light tank, only 2 mastered the T-70, and so the plan to build 27,500 cockroaches quickly came to nothing. Meanwhile, the number of plants producing the T-34 was expanding. On March 7, 1942, the State Defense Committee signed a decree to organize T-34 production at a plant in Omsk. The first T-34s were delivered in June 1942 on the site where T-50s had previously been planned, and that was only the beginning. Despite not having the best start in the summer of 1941, it was the T-34 that the Germans truly noticed in the autumn of that same year. This became especially evident during the winter of 1941 to 1942. The T-34 proved to be the tank, which, in Stalin's words, flew like a swallow over the snow. Of course, the greatest losses were suffered by the T-34s, but that was because they were often the only tanks able to reach the battlefield. Moreover, the T-34 fully met the demands placed upon it. For instance, the KV-1 had major issues with mobility, and by the spring of 1942, numerous complaints began to arrive about mechanical defects, particularly in the gearbox. The higher command saw the situation clearly, so the T-34 became a production priority. Its output was increasing, but not at the rate originally planned. Against this backdrop, Stalin reacted harshly to the production disruptions at the Stalingrad tractor plant. The People's Commissar of the tank industry, Vyacheslav Alexandrovich Malyshev, was removed from his position and demoted to deputy commissar. His place was taken by Isaac Moisevich Zaltzman, director of the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant. Isaac Moisevich, who assumed the position of People's Commissar of the tank industry on the 1st of July 1942, was given an unambiguous order to increase T-34 production at any cost. At the beginning of July 1942, production of the T-60 was stopped at 2 factories, one of which completely switched to manufacturing T-34 hulls, and on the 5th it was decided to organize T-34 production at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant. On the 28th of July, a decision was made to transfer one of the factories into the structure of the Ural Heavy Machinery plant, and to begin T-34 production there as well. As a result, by September 1942, the T-34 was being produced at 6 plants. However, the Stalingrad tractor plant soon dropped out of production because fighting had begun on its territory. Nevertheless, in October 1942, 1,499 T-34 tanks were delivered, and in December, a record 1,568 units were completed. The Stalingrad tractor plant, which was lost until the end of the war, was replaced by the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, where from the autumn of 1942 to March 1944, the main tank produced was the T-34. For its sake, production of heavy tanks was scaled back sharply. This was the only correct decision. At that time, producing T-34s was far more important than the KV-1s, especially since the heavy tank carried the same armament and did not significantly surpass it in armor protection. These energetic measures yielded a predictable result. By the end of 1942, just over 12,500 tanks of this type had been delivered. Even greater numbers followed in 1943. During that year, more than 15,000 T-34s were produced, and even the suspension of their production at the Ural Heavy Machinery Plant in the summer of 1943 had little effect on total output. This was because Sverdlovsk decided to focus on the production of self-propelled artillery vehicles based on the T-34 chassis. The second largest producer turned out to be the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, which built nearly 3,600 tanks. The situation changed only in the spring of 1944. This happened because of two important events. First, production began on a modernized version of the T-34 tank, which was named the T-34-85. Second, the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant started producing the heavy IS-2 tank. Since it was decided to manufacture the new tank in much larger quantities than its predecessors, the plant became overloaded. Therefore, in March 1944, production of the T-34 was halted there. However, during 1944, more than 14,000 T-34 tanks were produced, most of which, 10,632 vehicles, were the T-34-85 version. This machine remained the most important one, and even the production of its potential successor, the T-44 tank, was decided to be organized at a new site, the restored Plant No. 75 in Kharkov. At the same time, production of the T-34-85 continued until 1946. The fact that it remained in production despite the existence of the T-44 may seem strange, but only at first glance. First, the T-44 was difficult to master in production. Second, its successor, the T-54, turned out to be even more complex to manufacture. Therefore, the factories were instructed to continue producing the older tanks until production of the T-54 could be stabilized, and Plant No. 174 was even temporarily switched to manufacturing Su-100 self-propelled guns. This also explains why, in the 1950s, tank production in Poland and Czechoslovakia began specifically with the T-34-85. The more modern T-54 still required refinement, while the T-34-85 was simpler, and it was easier to set up production for it. Undoubtedly, the most difficult question is why exactly the T-34 is considered the best tank in history. There are many debates about this, and arguments are often presented that cause surprise. Usually, enthusiasts try to put the German Tiger at the top, a truly remarkable machine that greatly influenced the outcome of battles in 1943 and the first half of 1944. However, many people overestimate the Tiger. First, the concept of the best tank involves a whole set of parameters, and in several of them, the German heavy tank raises quite a few questions, including production numbers, reliability, and by the summer of 1944, it was no longer the most powerful vehicle on the battlefield. The Soviet heavy IS-2 tanks had their own opinion on this matter, based, among other things, on loss statistics. Second, the Tiger did not serve for long, and after the war, almost no one adopted it into service. Third, the combat readiness of the Tigers was supported by an extensive maintenance infrastructure. In simple terms, each one was followed by a whole train car full of spare parts. If one looks at things objectively, the best German tank was not the Tiger or the Panther, but the modest PEZ KPFW-4, a true soldier's machine, produced from the very beginning of the war to its end. It was this 4 that carried the main burden. After the war ended, its service continued for more than 20 years. Yet it is difficult to call the PEZ KPFW-4 the best tank of the Second World War. When it comes to the T-34, there are countless opinions, often completely opposite ones. Some people look for nothing but advantages in the tank, while others diligently search for flaws. Both pursuits are interesting, but in many ways, pointless. Perhaps this will surprise someone, but any tank is a product of compromise and has its own set of strengths and weaknesses. Moreover, advantages and disadvantages often overlap. The T-34 was not perfect either, but at the beginning of the German-Soviet War, it was the best medium tank in the world. It had the strongest armor protection, the most powerful gun in its class, and the best mobility. In March 1941, the L-11 gun was replaced with a more powerful and successful F-34 system, which also had better protection. At the same time, there were weaknesses. The key problem was poor visibility, which, by the way, is often confused with issues in the sights. In reality, the sights worked quite well, but the tank was blind, especially in terms of side visibility. A bad idea also turned out to be the single hatch on the turret. It had been persistently implemented since the time of the A-20 tank. The idea was to use the large flap as a kind of shield from behind which one could fire at the enemy. A similar solution can be seen on the turret of the BA-10 armored car. However, it turned out that such a hatch was difficult to open. Engine durability is also often mentioned among the drawbacks, specifically the short lifespan of the V2 engines, but in reality this belongs to the category of misunderstandings. As early as January 1941, the V2 engine successfully passed a 150-hour endurance test, and the factory continued to improve it further. Equally amusing is the belief that a Christie suspension is inherently bad. First, a whole series of vehicles, including the Israeli Merkava, would look at this claim with surprise. Second, the longitudinal rocking, the main problem of the BT and T-34 tanks, was cured on British cruiser tanks back in 1939, thanks to the introduction of telescopic shock absorbers. Third, without these same shock absorbers, even a torsion bar suspension will experience rocking. In essence, the only real drawback of the Christie suspension is the amount of internal space it occupies. But even that can be solved, as the experience of the Merkava has shown. It is worth noting again that in the second half of 1941, significant changes were planned for the T-34. Since the end of 1940, there had been work on switching the tank to a torsion bar suspension and widening the turret ring to 63 inches, 1,600 millimeters, as well as increasing the crew to 5 men. Initially, there were also plans to remove the driver's hatch from the front armor plate. This vulnerable element had already been targeted for removal on the A-34 tank, but the resulting cab design turned out poorly, so the production models used a one-piece hatch with 3 vision devices. As a result of all these planned modifications, the T-34M was prepared for serial production. Its final version looked much more like the standard T-34 than the earlier prototype. The frontal armor thickness increased to 2.36 inches, 60 millimeters. The driver received a new hatch with 2 vision devices. The torsion bar suspension and chevron pattern tracks were installed. The tank was fitted with an entirely new hexagonal turret featuring a commander's cupola and improved vision devices, as well as a redesigned gun mount. The war that began on June 22, 1941, prevented the introduction of this tank, so it had to fight with what was already available. Nevertheless, some of the T-34M's design ideas were implemented on production tanks as early as 1941, especially at the plant in Nizhny Tagil during the expansion of serial manufacturing. The hexagonal turret with small round hatches and its characteristic gun installation was a direct hello from the T-34M. It is also worth discussing the combat effectiveness of the T-34 during the first year of the war. A frequent question arises: if the T-34 was so good, why were so many lost? The answer lies in several factors. First, there was a serious visibility problem which caused more than half of all hits to strike the tank's sides. Second, the T-34 had relatively light shell-resistant armor. Reliable protection from German 37mm guns was available only on the frontal hull. The sides and turret could be penetrated by 37mm 1.5-inch shells from distances between 656 and 984 feet. Third, many forget that a tank's main enemy is not another tank but artillery, and the Germans had excellent anti-tank weapons. Fourth, the Germans already possessed significant combat experience, whereas for most T-34 crews, these were their very first battles. Combined with the general chaos of the summer and autumn of 1941, this had a serious effect on the overall outcome. Finally, a tank's combat debut rarely goes smoothly, and this was no exception. By the autumn of 1941, the Germans had begun to take serious notice of the T-34. This was largely due to the fact that the 34 was making up an ever-increasing share of the Red Army's armored forces. In July and August of 1941 alone, 723 T-34 tanks were delivered, and by the end of that year, a total of 1,886 had been produced. Since the T-34 was nothing like the BT or T-26, which could be penetrated by almost any type of anti-tank weapon, German troops began to complain about it, and soon they genuinely started to fear it. The situation that developed in the autumn of 1941 forced engineers to freeze further development of the T-34. Other priorities took precedence, above all, simplifying the design and increasing production output. In this regard, the Design Bureau of Plant No. 183 carried out enormous work between late 1941 and early 1942. As a result, the labor intensity of the tank's production was sharply reduced. In the summer of 1941, a T-34 cost 400,000 rubles, significantly more than a comparable German medium tank. By 1942, the price had dropped to 240,000 rubles. This was achieved through extensive simplifications. Automatic welding of hulls was introduced, a method developed by academician Yevgeny Oskarovich Paton. In addition, many components began to be produced by casting rather than machining. Naturally, this had its downside. The cast turret turned out to be heavier than the welded one, since 1.77 inches of rolled armor equaled 2.05 inches of cast armor. Other simplifications also increased the tank's weight. Thus, in 1941, the T-34 weighed 60,627 pounds. In 1942, it exceeded 63,934 pounds, and by 1943, it reached 66,139 pounds. As a result, problems began with the rubber rims on the road wheels. To begin with, there were general issues with rubber supply, so some factories started producing road wheels with internal cushioning. However, these were inferior to conventional ones with external rubber rims, so engineers tried to phase them out. Nonetheless, several plants continued manufacturing them up to and including 1943. By late 1942, reports of rubber rim failures on the road wheels began to increase. The destruction of rubber rims was caused by the rising combat weight of the tank, compounded by declining rubber quality. When the rubber began to soften and smear, further damage occurred at high speeds, above 19 to 25 miles per hour. It is worth noting that this problem was by no means unique to Soviet tanks. The supposedly high-speed German medium tank, favored by some authors, had exactly the same issue, even at a weight of 43,000 pounds. For that reason, German tankers were initially instructed not to exceed 25 miles per hour, and later a new gearbox was installed that physically limited the tank to that speed. The American medium tank Sherman had a similar restriction. In tests conducted in the Soviet Union, the Sherman reached 31 miles per hour, but under such conditions, the rubber rims of its road wheels quickly failed. Many complaints were also directed at the German Panther. Test reports frequently mentioned destroyed wheel rims. It is no coincidence that work was being carried out to introduce road wheels with internal cushioning on these tanks as well. The problem of track band failures on the T-34 was fought for several years, and was only partially resolved by 1944. At the same time, the destruction of the road wheels was not the main issue. To begin with, several factories reported problems with the quality of armor plates, especially one of the Ural plants. In addition, the order issued in the summer of 1942 to sharply increase tank production slowed the introduction of new elements that could improve the vehicle's combat efficiency. For example, the commander's cupola was reintroduced as early as 1942, but it was only implemented in the summer of 1943. Even then, the observation devices remained far from ideal until the arrival of the T-34-85. Finally, the need for high production volumes meant that neither in 1942 nor in 1943 was the T-34 replaced. This became evident in the summer of 1943, when the German Panthers debuted on the Kursk salient. Even by 1942, the German tanks were no longer the same as in the summer of 1941. German medium tanks had been equipped with long-barreled 50mm guns, and others received long-barreled 75mm guns. Moreover, German tanks had strengthened their armor protection. Thus, they could now fight the T-34 on equal terms, although the fear of the T-34 still lingered among the crews of German medium tanks. Despite the modernization of German medium tanks in 1942 and 1943, these machines still lagged behind the T-34 in several parameters. As shown by the tests of a captured German medium tank during the winter and summer of 1942, the German vehicle was inferior not only in speed, its cross-country capability turned out to be among the worst of all tested tanks. In swampy terrain, it quickly became stuck on its belly. The situation grew even worse during winter trials, particularly when overcoming snowbanks. While the German tank needed 16 minutes to get through, the T-34 broke through the obstacle in 10 seconds. The difference lay in power-to-weight ratio, vehicle mass, and ground pressure. The tested German tank had a combat weight of 47,000 pounds, while later upgraded versions weighed 50,000 pounds. The load on the suspension became so excessive that a 75mm gun could no longer be installed on that model. It was achieved only on another German medium tank, but then the combat weight rose first to 52,000 pounds and eventually to 55,000 pounds. Even with this reinforced armor protection, the German tank still had a weak spot: its turret. The frontal armor of the turret remained only 2 inches thick. German tanks are mentioned here for a reason. The modernization potential of the Panzer III was exhausted as early as the beginning of 1942, and that of the Panzer IV by the end of the same year. Even the replacement of the Panzer III with the Panthers did not solve all the problems. The most numerous German tank from 1943 to 1945 was the Panzer IV, and compared to how it was simplified over time, the problems of the T-34 look like child's play. The tank gradually lost its observation devices, and by 1944, only the commander's cupola remained, meaning that now the visibility problems were on the German side. In the late version of the Panzer IV, the turret traverse motor was removed, which created an additional problem with the gun's maneuverability. All this happened while the tank continued to be simplified further and further. There's nothing more to be said about the T-34-85. Even today, its recognizable silhouette occasionally appears in local conflicts. It so happened that by the end of the war, several tanks emerged that remained relevant long after its conclusion. Of course, when facing modern tanks, the T-34-85 no longer has enough power, but for infantry support, it is still quite suitable. Today, these vehicles are mostly used as self-propelled guns. Nevertheless, the fact that a tank designed as a quick solution in late 1943 still occasionally takes part in combat speaks for itself.